a topic which I've touched on in recent weeks, of course, and that is national security, foreign affairs, all of these matters. And yet again, it's been another quiet week out there. I mean, we only had South Korea declaring martial law. We've had the French government effectively falling. Issues all over the place. Syria, we're seeing rebels effectively putting the country, may take the country, which will cause other issues in the Middle East. So there are all sorts of issues, both near and far, going on in the world at any point in time. And front page of the Times today has got a piece which I really think brings everything into stark relief. Stretched MI5 forced to prioritise Russia over terrorists, says chief. What is this about? Well, Ken McCallum, the MI5 chief, has told a civil service podcast it only had finite resources, but was facing grander and more sophisticated attacks from aggressive nation states. MI5 has been forced to pare back, his words, not mine, its focus on counter-terrorism to deal with a growing threat posed by Russia and other hostile states. Now, Ken McCallum, who is the Director General of MI5, said that Britain was facing a generational challenge as it attempted to deal with the grander and more sophisticated attacks from aggressive states. And he said that the attacks included sabotage, arson, and assassinations on British soil. And we know that assassination attempts, indeed assassinations, have happened. Just remember Alexander Litvinenko. Remember the attempted poisoning with Novichok of the Skripals in Salisbury. Now, McCallum said that the UK had finite resources to deal with those threats and that he had been forced to make uncomfortable choices on where to focus the service's efforts. He said, we now face much, much more aggression from nation states. In effect, we had the 20, 30-year holiday from that kind of big player, sophisticated states in serious conflict with each other. It's back, I'm afraid. And he went on to say this. And so there is something quite profound about that. We've had to make some of these uncomfortable choices in recent years. How could we pare back a bit on the amount of our capacity we are spending on countering terrorism in order to be ready to meet these somewhat grander and more sophisticated, in some respects, threats from nation states? He also said that there's a growing threat from teenagers who consume too much of the wrong things on the internet. So that's MI5. So that's the chief of MI5, Ken McCallum. So just hold that for a second in your mind. And only just over a week ago, we had Sir Richard Moore, the head of MI6, which is the security intelligence service that deals with foreign threats. MI5, of course, dealing with domestic issues. And there is an overlap between the two. Of course there is. He had said, head of MI6, just over a week ago, Britain and its allies may face a reckoning as a new generation of potential terrorists are radicalised over the war in the Middle East. He also talked about the costs of supporting Ukraine, saying that it was an important cost to bear, but obviously it would potentially increase the domestic threat level. Now, just bear those two things in mind when we come to this conversation, because on the one hand, you've got an increasing risk of terrorist threat to the UK from events in the Middle East, and we've seen that what happens abroad can come back and have implications here. That's not to say that you have your foreign policy dictated by the threat of domestic terrorism. No, absolutely not. But a failure to take that into account in the round would be, I would say, an abdication of responsibility. So you've got that one thing on the one hand. The other thing you've got is the warning from MI5 that the threat from hostile states is increasing. And that brings me to my question, which is this. We had that big speech from Keir Starmer just on Thursday. 6 milestones, difficult to keep up with the whole thing. Not a mention, not a peep about national security, the security services in particular at all. Now, my question to you is this. Shouldn't national security be the first priority of the government? Shouldn't national security be the first priority of the government, of any government, for heaven's sake? 0345 6060 973, text 84850. Ask Alexa to send a comment to LBC. Now, joining me is Dominic Grieve, former Attorney General and former chair of the Intelligence and Security Committee. A very good afternoon to you, Dominic.
Good afternoon.
Highly unusual for the MI5 chief to be so open. What did you make of his comments?
They didn't come as any surprise, because we know, and indeed when I was chair of the committee, that we looked at how MI5 had been prioritising dealing with terrorism as opposed to state actors. And we knew that because there had been a great priority placed on on terrorism in the previous 15 to 20 years, actually the amount of resources that were being devoted to state actors such as Russia and China had correspondingly diminished. And we also know that as a consequence of what's been going on, MI5 has been having to redirect many of its resources towards the activities of state actors like Russia. Now, it's right to say that the intelligence services, whether it's MI5, MI6 or GCHQ, the one thing that can be said in an age of cuts is that their budgets have not been cut, indeed have increased consistently, I think, in the last 15 years. Their precise details are classified, but I'm quite satisfied that they have not been lacking for extra resources year on year. But I think that what Ken McCallum correctly shows is that even that is probably not sufficient in view of the extent and diversity of the risks which we are now facing. And of course, we also have to look at this in the context of the defence budget. Interestingly, the government has placed the budget of the intelligence agencies in the defence budget envelope when describing our total expenditure on national security, something which they didn't used to do, but has now been done in recent years. Admittedly, it's only a small percentage, but nevertheless, it's a significant percentage of the total budget. The reality is that our overall defence budget, in relation to the threats that we are facing, is absolutely ridiculous. And there is a marked reluctance by successive governments to come to terms with this. Because, of course, if you are going to come to terms with it and seriously increase our defence budget, which is absolutely clear is necessary, you're either going to have to raise much more money by way of taxes, or you're going to have to reprioritise public expenditure. And ever since the downfall of the Berlin Wall in 1990, we have been living, at least partially, off the peace dividend, which has enabled us to cut our defence budget to the point where, in fact, we no longer have viable defence forces.
Well, I think you've outlined the crux of the issue here, Dominic. And if I listen to what Keir Starmer said just a couple of days ago, he talked about raising living standards, rebuilding Britain, ending hospital backlogs. He talked about putting the police back on the beat, children getting the best start in life, securing homegrown energy. All very important things. But one of the foundations, I mean, one gets confused between pillars, foundations, milestones, all the rest of it. One of the foundations was meant to be national security, but the government has to put its money where its mouth is. There's going to be a spending review. Do you think we've taken our eye off the ball in terms of the range of threats that we face?
Yes, I do. And I think we have consistently failed to respond to the warning signs that indicated that the idea of spending 2% of your GDP on defence, when historically, bear in mind, in the 1960s and 70s and 80s, we were spending about 4% of our GDP on defence. But the idea that you can continue spending only 2% of your GDP on defence with the current threats is unrealistic. And of course, the danger is that if in fact this all goes wrong and deterrence fails, well, what will happen very quickly is we'll be spending 40 to 50% of our GDP on defence. And everything else will come to a grinding halt. I mean, I accept that governments have huge problems. They have lots of pressures on them. And I'm afraid they have public expectations in areas like health, which in my view are becoming increasingly difficult for any government to satisfactorily fulfil at any time, even of economic prosperity. So we've become a welfare-dependent society where governments, in order to be elected, have to produce the welfare benefits, or, and I'm pleased to see this, Keir Starmer has put some emphasis on policing, which has certainly been very badly neglected in recent times. But the fact is that national defence, which is one of the key duties of the state, has been neglected. And I'd be interested to see at what point we get to the tipping point where the realization dawns that, in fact, our current defence budget expenditure on national security is simply inadequate, and what we then do about it and how we go about remedying that.
Before I let you go, Dominic, how concerned are you? Sir John Sawyers, the former head of MI6, has warned that the return of Islamist extremist terrorist attacks on British soil could be prompted by the killings of Hamas and Hezbollah leaders. He said the police and spy agencies in Britain should be on their toes after the changes of leadership in the Middle East. How concerned are you? And thankfully, there hasn't been one that we are aware of, any terrorist attack yet. But certainly we should be very vigilant, shouldn't we?
Yes, we should, because I think the risk is a very real one. The Middle East is in turmoil. Syria is now in turmoil again. I'm not sure it ever left it, but it looks as if the situation is getting worse. And a lot of that has a knock-on effect in this country, although it is right to say that once the events in Iraq came to an end and essentially UK involvement in Iraq, things have quietened down and the risk of Islamist terrorism appears to have receded. But that said, it is clearly present and potentially could then start using up many resources, quite apart from the fact that if it starts again, the public will be very disquieted because we will have had more killings on British soil.
Thank you very much indeed, Dominic. That was Dominic Grieve, former Attorney General and former chair of the Intelligence and Security Committee. Look, it's very stark and extremely concerning. Look, I understand that governments have to make choices about where they allocate money. And Rachel Reeves and Sir Keir Starmer have talked about this spending review, which is going to be a line-by-line exercise where every single department in a bottom-up way is going to have to fight for and justify its spending line by line. They've also talked about, and Dominic Grieve was talking about, the defence budget there, and they've talked about this 2.5% being an aspiration that they want to get to as quickly as possible, but with no finite timeline to get there whatsoever. And if national security is tied into the overall defence approach of the government, we are in a very, very, very challenging place. I mean, I cannot remember the last time a head of MI5 so openly has come out and talked about the fact that he now faces a choice, effectively, of prioritising Russia and the threat from other hostile states over the threat posed by domestic terrorism. And he talks about the fact that when he was sort of being schooled in the intelligence service, he says this, during his first 2 decades in MI5, the organisation was largely preoccupied with terrorism. Northern Ireland in the 90s, then Al-Qaeda and Islamic State. He said that whilst those threats had not gone away, the increasing threat from hostile states led MI5 to change its approach. That's all very well, but the threat from terrorism hasn't exactly receded. And by the way, we also have an increasing threat of far-right terrorism as well in this country. So the way I'm framing this question is, to me, it's the statement of the bleeding obvious that the first priority of any government, before you get to the NHS, before you get to schools, before you get to social care or anything else, is the security of the nation. And therefore, my question to you is this. Shouldn't national security be the first priority of the government? And if so, why not a scintilla of a mention from Keir Starmer on Thursday? Go figure that one.